The Awakening, the Resurrection. Leo Tolstoy. Part 5. Chapter 33. Nekhlyudov rose the following morning with a consciousness that some change had taken place within him, and before he could recall what it was, he already knew that it was good and important. Katusha, the trial. Yes, and I must stop lying and tell all the truth. And what a remarkable coincidence. That very morning finally came the long-expected letter of Maria Vassilievna, the wife of the Marshal of the Nobility, that same letter that he wanted so badly now. She gave him his liberty and wished him happiness in his proposed marriage. Marriage, he repeated ironically. How far I am from it. And his determination of the day before to tell everything to her husband, to confess his sin before him, and to hold himself ready for any satisfaction he might demand, came to his mind. But this morning it did not seem to him so easy as it had yesterday. And then, what is the good of making a man miserable? If he asks me, I will tell him. But to call on him specially for that purpose, no, it is not necessary. It seemed to him equally difficult this morning to tell all the truth to Missy. He thought it would be offering an insult. It was inevitable, as in all worldly affairs, that there should remain something unexpressed, but understood. One thing, however, he decided upon this morning, that he would not go there and would tell the truth when asked. But in his relations toward Katusha, there was to be nothing unsaid. I will go to the jail, will tell her, beg of her to forgive me, and if necessary, yes, if necessary, I will marry her, he thought. The idea that for the sake of moral satisfaction he would sacrifice everything and marry her this morning particularly affected him. It was a long time since he had risen with so much energy in him. When Agrippina Petrovna entered his room, he declared to her with a determination which he himself did not expect that he had no further need of the house, and that he would dispense with her services. There was a tacit understanding that the large house was kept up for his contemplated marriage. The closing up of the house consequently had some particular significance. Agrippina Petrovna looked at him with surprise. I thank you very much, Agrippina Petrovna, for your solicitude in my behalf, but I do not now need such a large house or any of the servants. If you wish to help me, then be so kind as to pack away the things as you used to do in Mamma's lifetime. Natasha will dispose of them when she arrives. Natasha was Nekhlyudov's sister. Agrippina Petrovna shook her head. Dispose of them? Why, they will be needed, she said. No, they will not, Agrippina Petrovna. They will positively not be needed, said Nekhlyudov, answering what she meant by shaking his head. Please tell Kornei that his salary will be paid for 2 months in advance, but that I do not need him. You are wrong in doing this, Dmitri Ivanovich, she said. You will need a house, even if you go abroad. You misunderstand me, Agrippina Petrovna. I will not go abroad, and if I do go, it will be to an entirely different place. His face suddenly turned a purple color. Yes, it is necessary to tell her, he thought. I must tell all to everybody. A very strange and important thing has happened to me. Do you remember Katusha, who lived with Aunt Maria Ivanovna? Of course. I taught her to sew. Well then, she was tried in court yesterday, and I was one of the jury. Ah, good Lord, what a pity, said Agrippina Petrovna. What was she tried for? Murder, and it was all caused by me. How could you have caused it? You're talking very strangely, said Agrippina Petrovna, and fire sparkled in her old eyes. She knew of the incident with Katusha. Yes, it is my fault, and this causes me to change my plans. What change can this cause in your plans? Said Agrippina Petrovna, suppressing a smile. This, that since it was through my fault that she is in her present condition, I consider it my duty to help her to the extent of my ability. That is your affair, but I cannot see that you are so much in fault. It happens to everybody, and if one is guided by common sense, the matter is usually arranged and forgotten, and one lives on like the rest of the world, said Agrippina Petrovna sternly and seriously. There is no reason why you should take it so much to heart. I heard long ago that she had gone to the bad, so whose fault is it? It is my fault, and that is why I wish to make amends. Well, it is hard to set that right. That is my affair. If you are thinking of yourself, then that which mother wished. I am not thinking of myself. Your deceased mother showed me so many favors that I do not desire anything. My niece, Lizauka, wishes me to come to her, so I will go as soon as you need me no longer. Only you are taking it too much to heart. It happens with everybody. Well, I do not think so. I still ask you to help me rent the house and pack away the things. And do not be angry with me. I am very, very thankful to you for everything. It is remarkable that since Nekhlyudov understood that he was disgusted with himself, others ceased to be repulsive to him. On the contrary, he had a kindly and respectful feeling for Agrippina Petrovna and Korney. He wished to confess also before Korney, but the latter was so impressively respectful that he could not make up his mind to do it. On his way to the court, passing along the familiar streets, and in the same carriage, Nekhlyudov was himself surprised what a different man he felt himself today. His marriage to Missy, which but yesterday seemed to be so near, today appeared to him absolutely impossible. Yesterday he understood his position to be such that there could be no doubt that she would be happy to marry him. Today he felt himself unworthy not only of marrying her, but of being her friend. If she only knew who I was, she would never receive me, and yet I taunted her with coquetting with that gentleman. But no, even if she married me, I should never have peace, even though I were happy, while that one is in jail, and may any day be sent under escort to Siberia. While the woman whom I have ruined is tramping the weary road to penal servitude, I will be receiving congratulations and paying visits with my young wife. Or I will be counting the votes for and against school inspection, etc., with the marshal, whom I have shamefully deceived, and afterward make appointments with his wife. What abomination! Or I will work on my picture, which will, evidently, never be finished, for I had no business to occupy myself with such trifles. And I can do neither of these things now, he said to himself, happy at the inward change which he felt. First of all, he thought, I must see the lawyer, and then see her in jail, the convict of yesterday, and tell her everything. And when he thought how he would see her, confess his guilt before her, how he would declare to her that he would do everything in his power, marry her in order to wipe out his guilt, he became enraptured, and tears filled his eyes. Chapter 34. Arriving at the courthouse, Nekhlyudov met the usher in the corridor and asked him where the prisoners already sentenced were kept, and from whom permission could be obtained to see them. The usher told him that the prisoners were kept in various places, and that before final judgment the public prosecutor was the only person from whom permission to see them could be obtained. The prosecutor has not arrived yet. When he does, I will let you know, and will escort you myself to him after the session. And now, please to walk into the court. The session is commencing. Nekhlyudov thanked the usher, who seemed to him particularly pitiful today, and went into the jury room. As Nekhlyudov was approaching the jury room, his fellow jurors were coming out, repairing to the courtroom. The merchant was as cheerful, had lunched as well as yesterday, and greeted Nekhlyudov like an old friend. The loud laughter and familiarity of Peter Gerasimovich did not give rise today in Nekhlyudov of the unpleasant sensation of yesterday. Nekhlyudov wished to tell all the jurymen of his relations to the woman whom they had convicted yesterday. It would have been proper, he thought, yesterday to rise in court and publicly confess my guilt. But when with the other jurymen he entered the courtroom and witnessed the same procedure, the same, hear ye, the three judges in high collars on the elevation, the silence, the seating of the jury on high-backed chairs, the gendarmes, the priest, he felt that, though it was necessary to do it, he would not have been able even yesterday to break this solemnity. They went through the same preliminaries, except the swearing in of the jury and the justiciary's speech to them. A case of burglary was before the court. The prisoner, who was guarded by two gendarmes with unsheathed swords, was a 20-year-old boy with a bloodless face and in a grey coat. He sat alone on the prisoner's bench and scanned from under his eyebrows all those that entered the courtroom. This boy and another were charged with breaking the lock of a shed and stealing therefrom mats of the value of 3 rubles and 67 kopecks. It appeared from the indictment that a policeman caught the boy when he was walking with the other, who carried the mats on his shoulder. Both of them immediately confessed, and they were put in jail. The comrade of this boy, a locksmith, died in jail, and he was tried alone. The old mats lay on the table reserved for exhibits. The case was conducted in the same order as yesterday, with all the proofs, witnesses, experts, oath-taking, examinations and cross-examinations. The policeman, when questioned by the justiciary, complainant and the defence, made listless answers. Yes, sir. Can't tell. And again, yes, sir. But notwithstanding this, it was apparent that he pitied the boy and testified involuntarily against him. Another witness, a splenetic old man who owned those mats, when asked if they belonged to him, unwillingly testified that they were his. When, however, the prosecutor asked him what use he intended to make of them, and whether he needed them much, he became angry and answered, I wish they had been lost entirely, these mats. I don't need them at all. And if I had known that you would make so much fuss about them, I would gladly have given 10 rubles or 20 rather than be dragged into court. I have spent 5 rubles on carriages coming here and going back again, and I am sick. I am suffering from rupture and rheumatism. The prisoner admitted the charge against him, and like a trapped animal, stupidly looked now to one side, now to the other, and in a halting voice related everything as it happened. It was a clear case, but the prosecutor, as he did yesterday, raised his shoulders and propounded subtle questions which were calculated to entrap the clever criminal. In his speech, he argued that the theft was committed in a dwelling house by breaking and entering it, and that therefore the severest punishment should be meted out to him. Counsel for the defence, appointed by the court, argued that the theft was committed not in a dwelling house, and that though the prisoner pleaded guilty, he was not as dangerous to society as the prosecutor would have them believe. The justiciary was the personification of impartiality and justice, and endeavoured to impress on the jury that which they already knew and could not help knowing. Again they took recesses and smoked cigarettes, and again the usher shouted, Hear ye! And the 2 gendarmes sat, trying to keep awake. It developed during the trial that this boy had been apprenticed in a tobacco factory in which he worked 5 years. This year he was discharged by his employer after a misunderstanding with the employees, and going idly about the city, he spent all he had on drink. At an inn, he met a locksmith who had also been discharged and was drinking hard, and the two went at night, while drunk, to that shed, broke the lock, and took the first thing they saw. They were caught, and as they confessed, they were imprisoned. The locksmith, while waiting for a trial, died. The boy was now being tried as a dangerous creature from whom it was necessary to protect society. As dangerous a creature as the prisoner of yesterday, Nekhlyudov thought while watching the proceedings. They are dangerous, but are we not dangerous? I am a libertine, an impostor, and all of us, all those that know me as I am, not only do not detest, but respect me. It is evident that this boy is no villain, but a very ordinary person. Everyone sees that, and that he became what he is only because he lived amid conditions that beget such people. It is therefore plain that such boys will exist as long as the conditions producing these unfortunates remain unchanged. If anyone had taken pity on this boy, Nekhlyudov thought, while looking at the sickly, frightened face of the boy, before want had driven him from the village to the city and relieved that want, or when, after 12 hours' work in the factory, he was visiting inns with grown-up comrades, someone had told him, Don't go, Vanya, it is bad. The boy would not have gone, or got drunk, and the burglary would never have occurred. But no one pitied the boy during the time that he, like an animal, spent his school years in the city, and with close-cropped hair, to prevent his getting vermin, ran errands for the workmen. On the contrary, the only thing he had heard from the workmen and his comrades was to the effect that a brave fellow was he who cheated, drank, reviled, fought, or led a depraved life. And when, sickly and depraved from the unhealthy work, from drink and lewdness, foolish and capricious, he aimlessly prowled around the city, as in a dream, entered some shed, and abstracted a few worthless mats. Then, instead of destroying the causes that led this boy into his present condition, we intend to mend matters by punishing him. It is dreadful. Thus, Nekhlyudov thought, and no longer listened to what was going on around him. He was himself terrified at this revelation. He wondered why he had not seen it before, how others failed to see it. Chapter 35. As soon as the first recess was taken, Nekhlyudov rose and went out of the court, intending to return no more. They might do with him what they pleased, but he could no longer take part in that farce. Having inquired where the prosecutor's room was, he directed his steps toward that dignitary. The messenger would not admit him, declaring that the prosecutor was busy, but Nekhlyudov brushed past him and asked an officer who met him to announce him to the prosecutor, saying that he was on important business. His title and dress helped Nekhlyudov. The officer announced him, and he was admitted. The prosecutor received him standing, evidently dissatisfied with Nekhlyudov's persistence in seeking an audience with him. "What do you wish?" the prosecutor asked, sternly. "I am a juryman. My name is Nekhlyudov, and I want to see the prisoner Maslova," he said, resolutely and quickly. He blushed and felt that his act would have a decisive influence on his life. The prosecutor was a tall, swarthy man with short hair just turning grey, bright eyes, and a trimmed, bushy beard on the protruding lower jaw. "Maslova? Yes, I know her. She was charged with poisoning," he said calmly. "Why do you want to see her?" And then, as if desiring to soften his harsh demeanor, he added, "I cannot give you the permission before I know what you want to see her for." "It is very important for me to see her," Nekhlyudov burst out. "I see," said the prosecutor, and raising his eyes, looked intently at Nekhlyudov. "Has her case been tried?" "She was tried yesterday and sentenced to 4 years penal servitude. The conviction was irregular. She is innocent." "I see. If she has only been sentenced yesterday," said the prosecutor, without paying attention to Nekhlyudov's declaration about her innocence, "then she will be detained until final judgment in the place where she is now. The jail is open to visitors on certain days only. I advise you to apply there." "But I must see her as soon as possible," with trembling lower jaw, Nekhlyudov said, feeling that a critical moment was approaching. "Why are you so anxious about seeing her?" the prosecutor asked, raising his eyebrows with some alarm. "Because she is innocent of the crime for which she was sentenced to penal servitude. The guilt is mine, not hers," Nekhlyudov said in a trembling voice, feeling that he was saying what he should not. "How so?" asked the prosecutor. "I deceived her and brought her to the condition in which she is now. If I had not driven her to the position in which she was, she would not have been charged here with such a crime. Still, I fail to see what all this has to do with visiting her." "It has, because I want to follow her and marry her," said Nekhlyudov. And, as it usually happened when he spoke of this, his eyes filled with tears. "Ah, is that so?" said the prosecutor. "This is really an exceptional case. Are you not a member of the Krasnopersk Town Council?" asked the prosecutor, as if recalling that he had heard of this Nekhlyudov, who was now making such a strange statement. "Excuse me, but I fail to see what this has to do with my request." Fuming, Nekhlyudov answered with rancor. "Nothing, of course," the prosecutor said, with a faint smile on his face, and not in the least disturbed. "But your request is so unusual, and beside all customary forms. Well, can I get the permission?" "Permission? Why, yes. I will give you a pass immediately. Please be seated." He went to the table, sat down, and began to write. "Please be seated." Nekhludov stood still. When he had made out the pass, the prosecutor handed it to Nekhludov and eyed him with curiosity. "I must also tell you," said Nekhludov, "that I cannot continue to serve as juror. As you know, satisfactory reasons must be given to the court in such cases. The reasons are that I consider all courts useless and immoral." "I see," said the prosecutor, with the same faint smile which seemed to indicate that such statements were familiar to him and belonged to an amusing class of people well known to him. "I see. But you understand that, as public prosecutor, I cannot agree with you. I therefore advise you to state so to the court, which will either find your reasons satisfactory or unsatisfactory, and in the latter case will impose a fine on you. Apply to the court." "I have already stated my reasons, and I will not go there," Nekhludov said angrily. "I have the honor to salute you," said the prosecutor, bowing, evidently desiring to rid himself of the strange visitor. "Who was the man that just left your room?" asked one of the judges who entered the prosecutor's cabinet after Nekhludov had left. "Nekhludov. You know, the one who made such strange suggestions in the Krasnopersk town council. Just imagine, he is on the jury, and among the prisoners there was a woman or girl who was sentenced to penal servitude, and who, he says, was deceived by him. And now he wishes to marry her. It is impossible. That is what he told me, and how strangely excited he was. There is something wrong with our young men. He is not so very young. What a bore your famous Ivashukov is, my dear. He wins his cases by tiring us out. There is no end to his talking. They must be curbed, or they become real obstructionists." Chapter 36. From the public prosecutor, Nekhludov went straight to the detention house. But no one by the name of Maslova was there. The inspector told him that she might be found in the old temporary prison. Nekhludov went there and found that Catherine Maslova was one of the inmates. The distance between the detention house and the old prison was great, and Nekhludov did not arrive there until toward evening. He was about to open the door of the huge, gloomy building when the guards stopped him and rang the bell. The warden responded to the bell. Nekhludov showed the pass, but the warden told him that he could not be admitted without authority from the inspector. While climbing the stairs to the inspector's dwelling, Nekhludov heard the sounds of an intricate bravura played on the piano. And when the servant, with a handkerchief tied around one eye, opened the door, a flood of music dazed his senses. It was a tiresome rhapsody by Liszt, well played, but only to a certain place. When that place was reached, the melody repeated itself. Nekhludov asked the servant if the inspector was in. The servant said that he was not. "Will he be in soon?" The rhapsody again ceased, and with a noisy flourish again repeated itself. "I will go and inquire." And the servant went away. The rhapsody again went on at full speed, when suddenly, reaching a certain point, it came to a standstill, and a voice from within was heard. "Tell him that he is not home, and will not come today. He is visiting. Why do they bother us?" A woman's voice was heard to say, and the rhapsody continued, then ceased, and the sound of a chair moved back was heard. The angry pianist herself evidently wished to reprimand the importunate visitor who came at such a late hour. "Papa is not home," angrily said a pale, wretched-looking girl, with puffed-up hair and blue spots under her eyes, who came to the door. Seeing a young man in a good overcoat, she became calm. "Walk in, please. What do you wish to see him for?" "I would like to see a prisoner. I hold a pass from the prosecutor." "Well, I don't know. Papa is not in." "Why, walk in, please," she again called from the entrance hall. "Or apply to his assistant, who is now in the office. You may talk to him. And what is your name?" "Thank you," said Nekhludov, without answering the question, and went away. Scarcely had the door closed when the same vigorous, merry sound, so inappropriate to the place, and so persistently rehearsed by the wretched girl, was heard. In the courtyard, Nekhludov met a young officer with a stiff, dyed moustache, of whom he inquired for the assistant. He himself was the assistant. He took the pass, looked at it, and said that he could not admit anyone to the prison on a pass for the detention house. Besides, it was late. At 10 o'clock tomorrow, the prison is open to all visitors, and the inspector will be here. You could then see her in the common reception room, or, if the inspector permits it, in the office. So, without gaining an interview, Nekhlyudov returned home. Agitated by the expectation of seeing her, he walked along the streets, thinking not of the court, but of his conversations with the prosecutor and the inspectors, that he was seeking an interview with her, and told the prosecutor of his intention, and visited 2 prisons preparing for the ordeal, had so excited him that he could not calm down. On returning home, he immediately brought forth his unused diary, read some parts, and made the following entry. For 2 years I have kept no diary, and thought that I should never again return to this childishness. But it was no childishness, but a discourse with myself, with that true divine I which lives in every man. All this time I was slumbering, and I had no one to discourse with. It was awakened by the extraordinary event of the 28th of April, in court, where I sat as juryman. I saw her, Katusha, whom I had deceived on the prisoner's bench, in a prison coat. Through a strange misunderstanding and my mistake, she was sentenced to penal servitude. I have just returned from the prosecutor and the prison. I was not permitted to see her, but I am determined to do anything to see her, acknowledge my guilt, and make reparation, even by marrying her. Lord, help me. My soul is rejoicing. Chapter 37. For a long time that night, Maslova lay awake with open eyes, and looking at the door, mused. She was thinking that under no circumstances would she marry a convict on the island of Sagalin, but would settle down some other way, with some inspector or clerk, or even the warden or an assistant. They are all eager for such a thing. Only, I must not get thin. Otherwise, I am done for. And she recalled how she was looked at by her lawyer, the justiciary. In fact, everybody in the courtroom. She recalled how Bertha, who visited her in prison, told her that the student whom she loved while she was an inmate at Kitaeva's inquired about her and expressed his regrets when told of her condition. She recalled the fight with the red-haired woman and pitied her. She called to mind the baker who sent her an extra lunch roll and many others, but not Nekhlyudov. Of her childhood and youth, and especially of her love for Nekhlyudov, she never thought. That was too painful. These recollections were hidden deeply in her soul. She never saw Nekhlyudov even in a dream. She failed to recognize him in court, not so much because when she last saw him, he was an army officer, beardless, with small mustache and thick, short hair, while now he was no longer young in appearance and wore a beard, but more because she never thought of him. She had buried all recollections of her past relations with him in that terrible, dark night when, on his return from the army, he visited his aunts. Up to that night, while she hoped for his return, the child which she bore under her heart was not irksome to her. But from that night forward, everything changed, and the coming child was only a hindrance. Their aunts had asked Nekhlyudov to stop off at their station and call on them, but he wired that he would not be able to do it, as he had to reach St. Petersburg in time. When Katusha learned this, she decided to go to the railroad station to see him. The train was to pass at 2 o'clock in the morning. Katusha helped the ladies to bed, and, having induced the cook's girl, Mashka, to accompany her, she put on an old pair of shoes, threw a shawl over her head, gathered up her skirts, and ran to the station. It was a dark, rainy, windy autumn night. The rain now poured down in large, warm drops, now ceased. The road could not be distinguished in the field, and it was pitch dark in the woods. Although Katusha was familiar with the road, she lost her way in the woods and reached a substation, where the train only stopped for 3 minutes. Running on the platform, she espied Nekhlyudov through the window of a first-class car. The car was brightly illuminated. 2 officers sat on plush seats playing cards. On the table near the window, Two thick candles were burning. Nekhlyudov sat on the arm of the seat, his elbow resting on the back, laughing. As soon as she recognized him, she tapped on the window with her cold hand. But at that moment, the third bell rang, and the train began to move, the cars jostling each other forward. One of the players rose with the cards in his hands and began to look through the window. She tapped again and pressed her face against the window pane. At that moment, the car beside which she stood was tugged forward, and it moved along. She ran alongside, looking in the window. The officer tried to lower the window, but could not. Nekhlyudov rose, and pushing the officer aside, began lowering it. The train went faster, so that Katusha was obliged to run. The train moved still faster when the window was lowered. At that moment, the conductor pushed her aside and jumped on the car. She fell back, but continued to run along the wet boards of the platform, and when she reached the end of the platform and began to descend the steps to the ground, she almost fell exhausted. The first-class car was far ahead of her, and while she was running, the second-class cars passed her, then came with greater speed those of the third class. When the last car with the lanterns flew by her, she was already beyond the water tank, unsheltered from the wind which lashed her, blowing the shawl from her head and tangling her feet in her skirt. But still, she ran on. "Aunt Mikhailovna!" shouted the little girl. "You have lost your shawl." Katusha stopped, threw back her head, and covering her face with her hands, began to sob. "He is gone!" she cried. "While he is in a lighted car, sitting on a plush seat, jesting and drinking, I stand here in the mud, rain and wind, crying," she thought. She sat down on the ground and began to sob aloud. The little girl was frightened, and embracing her wet clothing, she said, "Auntie, let's go home. I will wait for the next train, throw myself under the wheels, and that will end it all." Katusha was meanwhile thinking, not heeding the girl. She made up her mind to carry out her intention, but as it always happens in the first moment of calm after a period of agitation, the child, his child, suddenly shuddered. Immediately, all that which so tortured her that she was willing to die, all her wrath and her desire to revenge herself even by death, passed. She became calm, arranged her clothing, put the shawl on her head, and went away. She returned home exhausted, wet and muddy. From that day began in her that spiritual transformation which ended in her present condition. From that terrible night on, she ceased to believe in God and in goodness. Before that night, she herself believed in God and believed that other people believed in him. But after that night, she became convinced that no one believed, and all that was said of God and his law was false and wrong. The one whom she loved, and who loved her, she knew it, abandoned her and made sport of her feelings, and he was the best of all the men she knew. All the others were even worse. This she saw confirmed in all that had happened. His aunts, pious old ladies, drove her out when she was no longer as useful as she used to be. All the women with whom she came in contact tried to make money by her. The men, beginning with the commissary and down to the prison officers, all looked upon her as a means of pleasure. The whole world was after pleasure. Her belief in this was strengthened by the old author whom she met during the second year of her independent life. He had told her frankly that this, he called it poetical and aesthetic, is all of life's happiness. Everyone lived for himself only, for his own pleasure, and all the words about God and goodness were deception. And if the question sometimes occurred to her, why were the affairs of the world so ill arranged that people harm each other and all suffer, she thought it best not to dwell on it. If she became lonesome, she took a drink, smoked a cigarette, and the feeling would pass away. Chapter 38. When at 5 o'clock the following morning, which was Sunday, the customary whistle blew, Korobleva, who was already awake, roused Maslova. "A convict," Maslova thought with horror, rubbing her eyes and involuntarily inhaling the foul morning air. She wished to fall asleep again, to transfer herself into a state of unconsciousness, but fear overcame her drowsiness. She raised herself, crossed her legs under her, and looked around. The women were already up, only the children were still sleeping. The moon-shining woman with bulging eyes was carefully removing her coat from under them. The rioter was drying near the oven some rags which served for swaddling cloths, while the child, in the hands of the blue-eyed Theodosia, was crying at the top of its lungs, the woman lulling it in a gentle voice. The consumptive, seizing her breast, coughed violently, and sighing at intervals, almost screamed. The red-headed woman lay prone on her back, relating a dream she had had. The old incendiary stood before the image, whispering the same words, crossing herself and bowing. The chanter's daughter sat motionless on her cot, and with dull, half-open eyes was looking into space. Miss Dandy was curling on her finger her oily, rough, black hair. Presently resounding steps were heard in the corridor. The lock creaked open, and two prisoners in short jackets and grey trousers, scarcely reaching their ankles, entered, and raising the ill-smelling vat on a yoke, carried it away. The women went to the faucets in the corridor to wash themselves. The red-headed woman got into a quarrel with a woman from the adjoining cell. Again there were cursing, shouting, and complaints. "You will get into the dark room yet," shouted the warden, and he slapped the red-headed woman on her fat, bare back so that it resounded through the entire corridor. "Don't let me hear you again." "Fooling again, you old man," she said, treating it as a caress. "Hurry up! It is time for mass." Scarcely had Maslova arranged her hair when the inspector entered with his attendants. "Make ready for inspection," shouted the warden. The women of the two cells formed in two rows along the corridor, those of the back row placing their hands on the shoulders of the women in the front row. Then they were counted. After the count came the woman inspector and led the prisoners to the church. Maslova and Theodosia were in the middle of the column, which consisted of over 100 women from all the cells. They all had white kerchiefs on their heads, and some few wore their own coloured dresses. These were the wives and children of convicts. The procession covered the whole stairway. A soft clatter of prison shoes was heard, here and there some conversation, and sometimes laughter. At a turn, Maslova noticed the malicious face of her enemy, Bochkova, who was walking in the front row, and pointed her out to Theodosia. At the foot of the stairs, the women became silent, and making the sign of the cross and bowing, they filed into the open door of the empty, gold-bedecked chapel. Their place was on the right, where, crowding each other, they began to arrange themselves in rows, standing. Behind the women came the male convicts who were serving terms or detained for transportation under sentence by the communities. Loudly clearing their throats, they formed a dense crowd on the left and the middle of the chapel. Above, on the gallery, were other convicts with heads half-shaven, whose presence was manifested by a clanking of chains. This prison chapel had been rebuilt and remodelled by a rich merchant who had spent about 30,000 rubles on it, and it was all ornamented with gilt and bright colours. For a few seconds there was silence, which was broken only by the blowing of noses, coughing, and clanking of chains. Suddenly, the prisoners who stood in the middle began to press back, making a passage for the inspector, who walked to the middle of the chapel, and the services commenced. Chapter 39. Nekhlyudov left the house early. A peasant was driving along a side alley, shouting in a strange voice, "Milk! Milk! Milk!" The first warm spring rain had fallen the evening before. Wherever there was a patch of unpaved ground, the green grass burst forth. The lindens were covered with green nap. The foul cherry and poplar unfolded their long, fragrant leaves. In the marketplace, through which Nekhlyudov had to pass, dense crowds in rags swarmed before the tents, some carrying boots under their arms, others smoothly pressed trousers and vests on their shoulders. The working people were already crowding near the tractors, tea-houses. The men in clean, long coats gathered in folds in the back of the waist and in shining boots. The women in bright-coloured silk shawls and cloaks with glass bead trimmings. Policemen, with pistols attached to yellow cords fastened around their waists, stood at their posts. Children and dogs played on the grass plots, and gay nurses sat chatting on the benches. On the streets, the left sides of which were yet cool, moist and shady, heavy carts and light cabs rumbled and jostled, the tram cars rang their bells. The air was agitated by the pealing of the church bells, summoning the people to mass. The driver stopped at a turn some distance from the prison. A few men and women stood around, most of them with bundles in their hands. To the right stood a few frame houses. To the left, a two-story building, over which hung a large sign. The large prison itself was directly in front. An armed soldier walked to and fro, challenging everyone attempting to pass him. At the gate of the frame building sat the warden in uniform, with an entry booklet in his hand. He made entries of visitors and those whom they wished to see. Nekhlyudov approached him, gave his name and that of Maslova, and the officer entered them in his book. "Why don't they open the door?" asked Nekhlyudov. "The morning service is on. As soon as it is over, you will be admitted." Nekhlyudov returned among the waiting crowd. A man in threadbare clothing, rumpled hat and slippers on his bare feet, and his face full of red lines, pushed his way through the crowd and walked toward the prison door. "Where are you going?" shouted the soldier. "What are you bawling about?" answered the man, entirely undisturbed by the soldier's challenge. "If I can't go in, I will wait. No use bawling as if you were a general." The crowd laughed approvingly. Most of the visitors were poorly dressed, even ragged, but judging by outward appearance, there were also some decent men and women among them. Beside Nekhlyudov stood a well-dressed man, clean-shaven, stout, and with rosy cheeks, who carried a bundle of what looked like linen. Nekhlyudov asked him if that was his first visit. The man answered that he came there every Sunday, and they entered into conversation. He was an employee of a bank whose brother was under indictment for forgery. This kind-hearted man told Nekhlyudov all his story and was about to ask him about his own when their attention was attracted by a rubber-tired carriage drawn by a blooded chestnut horse. The carriage was occupied by a student and a lady whose face was hidden under a veil. The student alighted, holding in his hand a large bundle. He approached Nekhlyudov and asked him where and how he should deliver the loaves of bread he had brought for the prisoners. "I brought them at the request of my bride. That is my bride. Her parents advised us to bring some alms for the prisoners." "I really don't know, for I am here for the first time, but I think that officer will tell you," said Nekhlyudov, pointing to the warden in the crown-laced uniform. While Nekhlyudov was talking to the student, the large iron gate of the prison opened, and a uniformed officer with another warden came out. The one with the booklet in his hand announced that the prison was open for visitors. The guard stood aside, and all the visitors, as if fearing to be late, with quick step, and some even running, pressed toward the prison gate. One of the wardens stationed himself at the gate, and in a loud voice counted the passing visitors, 16, 17, 18, etc. The other warden, within the gate, touching each with his hand, also counted the visitors as they entered another door. This was to make sure that at their departure no visitor remained in prison, and no prisoner made his way out. The tallying officer, without regard to the person of the visitor, slapped Nekhlyudov on the back. This at first offended the latter, but he immediately remembered his mission, and he became ashamed that his feelings should be thus wounded. The second door opened into a large, vaulted room with small, iron-grated windows. In this room, which was called the meeting room, Nekhlyudov saw in a niche a large image of the crucifixion. Nekhlyudov went on slowly, letting the hurrying visitors pass before, and experienced a mingled feeling of horror at the malefactors imprisoned in this jail, compassion for those innocent people who, like the boy and Katusha, must be here, and timidity and tenderness before the meeting that was before him. When he reached the end of the room, the warden said something, but Nekhlyudov, who was absorbed in his thoughts, paid no attention to it and followed in the direction led by the crowd, that is, to the men's ward instead of the women's. Letting the hurrying visitors pass, he walked into the next room designated for interviews. On opening the door, he was struck by the deafening shouts of 100 throats turned into a continuous humming noise. Only as he neared the people, who, like flies swarming on sugar, pressed their faces against a net which divided the room in two, did Nekhlyudov understand the cause of the noise. This room with windows in the rear wall was divided in two, not by one, but by two wire nets which stretched from the ceiling to the floor. Two wardens walked between the nets. The prisoners were on the other side of the nets, between which there was a space of about 7 feet for visitors, so that not only was it difficult to converse with them, but a short-sighted man could not even see the face of the prisoner he was visiting. In order to be heard, it was necessary to shout at the top of one's voice. On both sides, pressing against the nets, were the faces of wives, husbands, fathers, mothers, children, who endeavored to see and speak to each other. But as everyone tried to speak so that he could be heard by the person spoken to, and his neighbor did the same, their voices interfered with each other, and each tried to outcry the other. The result was the noise which astonished Nekhlyudov when he entered the room. It was absolutely impossible to understand the conversations. Only by the expression of the people's faces could one judge what they were speaking about, and what relation the speakers sustained toward each other. Near Nekhlyudov was an old woman with a small kerchief on her head, who, with trembling chin, shouted to a pale young man with head half-shaven. The prisoner, knitting his brow, was listening to her with raised eyebrows. Beside the old woman stood a young man in a long coat, who was nodding his head while listening to a prisoner with a weary face and beard turning grey, who greatly resembled him. Further on stood a ragamuffin waving his hand, shouting and laughing. On the floor beside this man sat a woman in a good woolen dress with a child in her arms. She wept bitterly, evidently seeing for the first time that grey-haired man on the other side of the net, manacled in a prison jacket and with head half-shaven. Over this woman stood the bank employee shouting at the top of his voice to a bald-headed prisoner with shining eyes. Nekhlyudov remained in this room about 5 minutes, experiencing a strange feeling of anguish, a consciousness of his impotence at the discord in the world, and he was seized with a sensation like a rocking on board of a ship. "But I must fulfill my mission," he said to himself, taking heart. "What am I to do?" As he looked around for some officer, he saw a middle-sized man with moustache, wearing epaulettes, who was walking behind the crowd. "Sir, could you not tell me where the women are kept, and where it is permitted to see them?" he asked, making a particular effort to be polite. "You wish to go to the women's ward?" "Yes, I would like to see one of the women prisoners," Nekhlyudov said, with the same strained politeness. "You should have said so in the meeting room. Whom do you wish to see, then?" "I wish to see Catherine Maslova." "Has she been sentenced?" "Yes, she was sentenced the other day," he said humbly, as if fearing to ruffle the temper of the officer, who seemed to be interested in him. "Then this way, please," said the inspector, who had evidently decided from Nekhlyudov's appearance that he deserved attention. "Sidorov." He turned to a warrant officer wearing a moustache and medals on his breast. "Show this gentleman to the women's ward." "All right, sir." At that moment, heart-rending cries came from the direction of the grating. All this seemed strange to Nekhlyudov, and strangest of all was that he was obliged to thank and feel himself under obligation to the inspector and warden. The warden led Nekhlyudov from the men's ward into the corridor, and through the open door opposite admitted him to the women's meeting room. Chapter 40. This room, like the one in the men's ward, was also divided in 3 by 2 nets, but it was considerably smaller. There were also fewer visitors and fewer prisoners, but the noise was as great as in the men's room. Here, also, the authorities stood guard between the nets. The authorities were here represented by a matron in uniform with crown-laced sleeves and fringed with blue braid and a belt of the same colour. Here, too, people pressed against the nets, in the passage, city folks in divers dresses. Behind the nets, female prisoners, some in white, others in their own dresses. The whole net was lined with people. Some stood on tiptoe, speaking over the heads of others. Others, again, sat on the floor and conversed. The most remarkable of the women prisoners, both in her shouting and appearance, was a thin, ragged gypsy with a kerchief which had slipped from her head, who stood almost in the middle of the room, near a post, behind the net, gesticulating and shouting to a short and tightly belted gypsy in a blue coat. A soldier sat beside him on the floor, talking to a prisoner. Beyond stood a young peasant with a light beard and in bast shoes, pressing his flushed face to the net, evidently with difficulty suppressing his tears. He was talking to a pretty, light-haired prisoner who gazed at him with her bright blue eyes. This was Theodosia with her husband. Beside them stood a tramp who was talking to a dishevelled, broad-faced woman. Further on there were two women, a man and again a woman, and opposite each was a prisoner. Maslova was not among them, but behind the prisoners stood another woman. Nekhlyudov felt the beating of his heart increasing and his breath failing him. The decisive moment was approaching. He neared the net and recognized Katusha. She stood behind the blue-eyed Theodosia and, smiling, listened to her conversation. She did not wear the prison coat, but a white waist, tightly belted and rising high above the breast. As in the court, her black hair hung in curls over her kerchiefed forehead. It will all be over in a moment, he thought. Shall I address her, or shall I wait till she addresses me? But she did not address him. She was waiting for Clara, and never thought that that man came to see her. "Whom do you wish to see?" the matron asked Nekhlyudov, approaching him. "Catherine Maslova," he stammered. "Maslova, you are wanted," shouted the matron. Maslova turned round, raised her head, and with the familiar expression of submissiveness, came to the net. She did not recognize Nekhlyudov and gazed at him in surprise. However, judging by his dress that he was a rich man, she smiled. "What are you?" she asked, pressing her smiling face with squinting eyes against the net. "I wish to see—" He did not know whether to use the respectful you or the endearing thou, and decided on the former. He spoke no louder than usual. "I wish to see you. I—" "Don't give me any of your song and dance," the tramp beside him shouted. "Did you take it, or did you not?" "She is dying. She is very weak," someone shouted on the other side. Maslova could not hear Nekhlyudov, but the expression of his face, as she spoke, suddenly reminded her of that which she did not wish to think of. The smile disappeared from her face, and a wrinkle on her brow evidenced her suffering. "I cannot hear what you are saying," she shouted, blinking and still more knitting her brows. "I came. Yes, I am doing my duty. I am repenting," thought Nekhlyudov, and immediately tears filled his eyes, and he felt a choking sensation in his throat. His fingers clutched at the net, and he made efforts to keep from sobbing. "I should not have gone if you were well," came from one side. "I swear by God I know nothing about it," cried a prisoner from the other side. Maslova noticed his agitation, and it communicated itself to her. Her eyes sparkled, and her puffy white cheeks became covered with red spots, but her face retained its severity, and her squinting eyes stared past him. "You are like him, but I don't know you," she shouted. "I came here to ask your forgiveness," he said in a loud voice, without intonation, as if repeating a lesson he had learned by heart. As he said these words, he felt ashamed and looked round. But the thought immediately came to his mind that it was well that he was ashamed, for he ought to bear the shame. And in a loud voice he continued, "I acted meanly, infamously. Forgive me." She stood motionless, her squinting eyes fixed on him. He could not continue and left the net, making efforts to stifle the sobbing which was convulsing his breast. The inspector who directed Nekhlyudov to the women's ward, evidently becoming interested in him, came into the room and, seeing him in the middle of the passage, asked him why he was not speaking with the prisoner he had inquired about. Nekhlyudov blew his nose and, endeavoring to assume an air of calmness, said, "I can't speak through the net. Nothing can be heard." The inspector mused a while. Well then, she can be brought out for a while. Maria Karlovna, he turned to the matron, lead Maslova out. Chapter 41. A moment afterward, Maslova came out through a side door. With gentle step, she came up to Nekhlyudov, stopped and glanced at him from under her lowered eyebrows. Her black hair stood out on her forehead in curly ringlets. Her unhealthy, bloated, white face was pretty and very calm. Only her shining black, squinting eyes sparkled from under their swollen lashes. "You may talk here," said the inspector, and went aside. Nekhlyudov moved toward a bench standing beside the wall. Maslova glanced inquiringly at the inspector and, shrugging her shoulders as if in wonder, followed Nekhlyudov to the bench and, straightening her skirt, sat down beside him. "I know that it is hard for you to forgive me," began Nekhlyudov, but feeling the tears flooding his eyes, again stopped. "But if the past cannot be mended, I will do now everything in my power. Tell me, how did you find me?" she asked, without answering his question, her squinting eyes looking and not looking at him. "Oh, Lord, help me, teach me what to do," Nekhlyudov said to himself, as he looked at her face so completely changed. "I was on the jury when you were tried," he said. "You did not recognize me?" "No, I did not. I had no time to recognize you. Besides, I did not look," she answered. "Wasn't there a child?" he asked, and he felt his face turning red. "It died at that time, thank God," she said with bitterness, turning away her head. "How did it happen?" "I was ill myself, nearly died," she said without raising her eyes. "How could the aunts let you go?" "Who would keep a servant with a child? As soon as they noticed it, they drove me out. But what is the use of talking? I don't remember anything. It is all over now." "No, it is not over. I cannot leave it thus. I now wish to atone for my sin." "There is nothing to atone for. What's gone is gone," she said. And all unexpected to him, she suddenly looked at him and smiled in an alluring and piteous manner. His appearance was entirely unexpected to Maslova, especially at this time and place, and therefore the astonishment of the first moment brought to her mind that of which she never thought before. At the first moment, she hazily recalled that new, wonderful world of feeling and thought which had been opened to her by that charming young man who loved her and whom she loved, and then his inexplicable cruelty and the long chain of humiliation and suffering which followed as the direct result of that enchanting bliss, and it pained her. But being unable to account for it all, she did the customary thing for her, banished all these recollections from her mind, and endeavored to obscure them by a life of dissipation. At first, she associated this man who sat beside her with that young man whom she had loved once, but as the thought pained her, she drove it from her mind. And now, this neatly dressed gentleman, with perfumed beard, was to her not that Nekhlyudov whom she had loved, but one of those people who, as opportunity afforded, were taking advantage of such creatures as she, and of whom such creatures as she ought to take advantage as opportunity offers. For this reason, she smiled alluringly. She was silent, thinking how to profit by him. "All that is over now," she said, "and here I am, sentenced to penal servitude." Her lips trembled as she spoke the terrible word. I was certain that you were innocent," said Nekhlyudov. "Of course I was innocent. I am no thief or robber. They say here that it all depends on the lawyer, that it is necessary to appeal. Only they say it comes very high." "Yes, certainly," said Nekhlyudov. "I have already seen a lawyer." "One must not be sparing, and get a good one," she said. "I will do everything in my power." They were silent. She again smiled as before. "I would like to ask you for some money if you have it. Not much, say 10 roubles," she said suddenly. "Yes, yes," said Nekhlyudov, abashed, and thrust his hand in his pocket. She quickly glanced at the inspector, who was walking up and down the aisle. "Don't let him see it, or he will take it away." Nekhlyudov took out his pocketbook as soon as the director turned his back on them, But before he could hand her the 10-ruble bill, the inspector turned round, facing them. He crumpled the bill in his hand. Why, she is a dead woman, thought Nekhlyudov, as he looked at her once lovely, but now defiled, bloated face with the unhealthy sparkle in her black, squinting eyes, which looked now at the inspector, now at Nekhlyudov's hand with the crumpled bill. And a moment of hesitation came over him. Again, the tempter of the night before whispered in his soul, endeavouring to turn the question, what would be the best thing to do? Into, what will be the end of it? You can do nothing with that woman, whispered the voice. She will be like a stone around your neck, which will drag you down and prevent your being useful to others. Give her all the money you have, bid her goodbye, and put an end to it for all time. And immediately he became aware that something important was taking place in his soul, that his inner life was on a wavering scale, which could by the slightest effort be made to overbalance to one side or the other. And he made that effort, calling on that God whom the other day he felt in his soul, and God immediately came to his aid. He resolved to tell her all. Katusha, I came to ask your forgiveness, but you have not answered me whether you have forgiven me or ever will forgive me, he said suddenly. She was not listening to him, but looked now at his hand, now at the inspector. When the latter turned away, she quickly stretched forth her hand, seized the money from Nekhlyudov's hand, and stuck it behind her belt. How funny, she said, smiling contemptuously as it seemed to him. Nekhlyudov saw that there was something inimical to him in her, which stood guard, as it were, over her as she was now, and prevented him from penetrating into her heart. But, wonderful to relate, so far from repulsing him, this only drew him to her by some new, peculiar force. He felt that he ought to awaken her spirit, that it was extremely difficult to do so, but the very difficulty of the undertaking attracted him. He experienced a feeling toward her which he had never experienced before, either toward her or anyone else, and in which there was nothing personal. He desired nothing of her for himself, and only wished her, too, to cease to be what she was now and become what she had been before. Katusha, why do you speak thus? I know you. I remember you as you were in Panov. But she did not yield. She would not yield. Why recall the past? She said dryly, frowning even more. Because I wish to efface, to expiate my sin. Katyusha, he began, and was about to tell her that he would marry her, but he met her eyes in which he read something so terrible, rude and repulsive that he could not finish. At that moment, the visitors began to take leave. The inspector approached Nekhlyudov and told him that the time for interviewing was ended. Maslova rose and submissively waited to be dismissed. Goodbye. I have a great deal to tell you yet, but as you see, I cannot do it now, said Nekhlyudov, and extended his hand. I will call again. I think you have said everything. She extended her hand, but did not press his. No, I will try to see you again, where we can speak together, and then I will tell you something very important, said Nekhlyudov. Well, all right, she said, smiling as she used to do when she wished to please a man. You are more to me than a sister, said Nekhlyudov. Funny, she repeated, and shaking her head, she went behind the grating. Chapter 42. Nekhlyudov expected that at the first meeting Katyusha, learning of his intention to serve her and of his repentance, would be moved to rejoicing, would become again Katyusha. But to his surprise and horror, he saw that Katyusha was no more, that only Maslova remained. It surprised him particularly that not only was Maslova not ashamed of her condition, but on the contrary, she seemed to be content with, and even took pride in it. And yet, it could not be different. It is usually thought that a thief or murderer, acknowledging the harmfulness of his occupation, ought to be ashamed of it. The truth is just the contrary. People whom fate and their sinful mistakes have placed in a given condition form such views of life generally that they are enabled to consider their condition useful and morally tenable. In order, however, to maintain such views, they instinctively cling to such circles in which the same views are held. We are surprised when we hear thieves boasting of their cleverness or murderers boasting of their cruelty, but that is only because their circle is limited and because we are outside of it. This was the case also with Maslova. She was sentenced to penal servitude, and yet she formed such views of life and her place in it that she could find reasons for self-approval and even boast before people of her condition. The substance of this view was that the greatest welfare of all men, without exception, young, old, students, generals, educated and uneducated, consisted in associating with attractive women, and that therefore all men, while pretending to occupy themselves with other business, in reality desire nothing else. Now, she is an attractive woman, and can satisfy that desire of theirs, or not, as she wishes. Hence, she is a necessary and important person. All her life, past and present, attested the justice of this view. Whomever she met during 10 years, beginning with Nekhlyudov and the old commissary of police, and ending with the jailers, all wanted her. She had not met anyone who did not want her. Hence, the world appeared to her as an aggregation of people who watched her from all sides and by all possible means: deceit, violence, gold or craftiness, strewn to possess her. With such an idea of life, Maslova considered herself a most important person, and she cherished this view above all else in the world, because to change it would be to lose that standing among people which it assured her. And in order not to lose her standing, she instinctively clung to that circle which held the same views of life. Seeing, however, that Nekhlyudov wished to lead her into another world, she resisted it, feeling that in that other world into which he was luring her, she would lose her present standing, which gave her confidence and self-respect. For the same reason she drove from her mind all recollection of her first youth and her first relations to Nekhlyudov. These recollections clashed with her present views of life, and for that reason were entirely effaced from her memory, or rather, were preserved somewhere in her memory, but were covered up, as it were, with a thick plastering to prevent any access to them. Nekhlyudov was, therefore, to her not that man whom she had loved with a pure love, but merely a rich gentleman by whom one may and ought to profit, and who was to be treated like any other man. I did not tell her the most important thing, thought Nekhlyudov, as with the other people he walked toward the door. I did not tell her that I would marry her, but I will do it. The inspectors at the doors counted the visitors, each with one hand slapping every visitor on the back, but Nekhlyudov was not offended by it now. He even took no notice of it. Chapter 43. It was Nekhlyudov's intention to alter his manner of living, discharge the servants, let the house and take rooms in a hotel. But Agrippina Petrovna argued that no one would rent the house in the summer, and that as it was necessary to live somewhere and keep the furniture and things, he might as well remain where he was. So that all efforts of Nekhlyudov to lead a simple, student life came to naught. Not only was the old arrangement of things continued, but, as in former times, the house received a general cleaning. First were brought out and hung on a rope uniforms and strange fur garments which were never used by anybody, then carpets, furniture, and the porter, with his assistant, rolling up the sleeves on their muscular arms, began to beat these things, and the odor of camphor rose all over the house. Walking through the courtyard and looking out of the window, Nekhlyudov wondered at the great number of unnecessary things kept in the house. The only purpose these things served, he thought, was to afford the servants an opportunity of exercise. It isn't worthwhile to alter my mode of life while Maslova's affair is unsettled, he thought. Besides, it is too hard. When she is discharged or transported, and I follow her, things will change of their own accord. On the day appointed by the lawyer Fanirin, Nekhlyudov called on him. On entering the magnificently appointed apartments of the house owned by the lawyer himself, with its huge plants, remarkable curtains, and other evidences of luxury, attesting easily earned wealth, Nekhludov found in the reception room a number of people sitting dejectedly around tables on which lay illustrated journals intended for their diversion. The lawyer's clerk, who was sitting in this room at a high desk, recognizing Nekhludov, greeted him and said that he would announce him. But before the clerk reached the door of the cabinet, the door opened, and the animated voices of a thick-set man with a red face and stubby mustache, wearing a new suit, and Fanirin himself were heard. The expression on their faces was such as is seen on people who had just made a profitable but not very honest bargain. "It is your own fault, my dear sir," Fanirin said, smiling. "I would gladly go to heaven, but my sins prevent me." "That is all right." And both laughed unnaturally. "Ah, Prince Nekhludov, pleased to see you," said Fanirin, and bowing again to the departing merchant, he led Nekhludov into his business-like cabinet. "Please take a cigarette," said the lawyer, seating himself opposite Nekhludov and suppressing a smile called forth by the success of the preceding affair. "Thank you. I came to inquire about Maslova's case." "Yes, yes, immediately. My, what rogues these moneybags are," he said. "You have seen that fellow. He is worth 12 millions and is the meanest skinflint I ever met." Nekhludov felt an irresistible loathing toward this ready talker who, by his tone of voice, meant to show that he and Nekhludov belonged to a different sphere than the other clients. "He worried me to death. He is an awful rogue. I wanted to ease my mind," said the lawyer, as if justifying his not speaking about Nekhludov's case. "And now, as to your case, I have carefully examined it and could not approve the contents thereof, as Turgenev has it. That is to say, the lawyer was a wretched one, and he let slip all the grounds of appeal." "What have you decided to do?" "One moment. Tell him," he turned to his clerk, who had just entered, "that I will not change my terms. He can accept them or not, as he pleases." "He does not accept them." "Well then, let him go," said the lawyer, and his benign and joyful countenance suddenly assumed a gloomy and angry expression. "They say that lawyers take money for nothing," he said, again assuming a pleasant expression. "I succeeded in obtaining the discharge of an insolent debtor who was incarcerated on flimsy accusations of fraud, and now they all run after me. And every such case requires great labor. We too, you know, leave some of our flesh in the inkpot, as some author said." "Well, now, your case, or rather the case in which you are interested," he continued, "was badly conducted. There are no good grounds for appeal, but of course we can make an attempt. This is what I have written." He took a sheet of paper, and quickly swallowing some uninteresting formal words and emphasizing others, he began to read. "To the Department of Cassation, etc., etc., Catherine, etc., petition, by the decision, etc., of the etc., rendered, etc., a certain Maslova was found guilty of taking the life, by poisoning, of a certain merchant Smelkoff, and in pursuance of Chapter 1, 1454 of the Code, was sentenced to, etc., with hard labor, etc." He stopped, evidently listening with pleasure to his own composition, although from constant use he knew the forms by heart. "This sentence is the result of grave errors," he continued with emphasis, "and ought to be reversed for the following reasons. First, the reading in the indictment of the description of the entrails of Smelkoff was interrupted by the justiciary at the very beginning. 1. But the prosecutor demanded its reading," Nekhludov said with surprise. "That is immaterial. The defense could have demanded the same thing. But that was entirely unnecessary. No matter, it is a ground of appeal. Further. Second, Maslova's attorney," he continued to read, "was interrupted while addressing the jury by the justiciary when, desiring to depict the character of Maslova, he touched upon the inner causes of her fall. The ground for refusing to permit him to continue his address was stated to be irrelevancy to the question at issue. But as has often been pointed out by the Senate, the character and moral features generally of an accused are to be given the greatest weight in determining the question of intent. 2. But he spoke so badly that we could not understand him. said Nekhlyudov with still greater surprise. "He is a very foolish fellow, and of course could say nothing sensible," Fanarin said, laughing. "However, it is a ground for appeal. Third, in his closing words, the justiciary, contrary to the positive requirements of Section 1, Chapter 801 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, failed to explain to the jury of what legal elements the theory of guilt consisted. Nor did he tell them that if they found that Maslova gave the poison to Smelkov, but without intent to kill, they had the power to discharge her. This is the principal point. We could have known that. That was our mistake. And finally, fourth, continued the lawyer, the answer of the jury to the question of Maslova's guilt was made in a form which was obviously contradictory. Maslova was charged with intentional poisoning of Smelkov and with robbery as a motive, while the jury, in their answer, denied her guilt of the robbery, from which it was evident that they intended to acquit her of the intent to kill. Their failure to do so was due to the incomplete charge of the justiciary. Such an answer, therefore, demanded the application of chapters 816 and 808 of the Code. That is to say, it was the duty of the presiding justice to explain to the jury their mistake and refer the question of the guilt of the accused to them for further deliberation. Why, then, did he not do it? That is just what I would like to know myself, said Fanarin, laughing. So the Senate will correct the mistake. That will depend on who will be sitting there when the case is heard. Well, and then we continue. Under these circumstances, the court erred in imposing on Maslova punishment, and the application to her of Section 3, Chapter 771 of the Code was a serious violation of the basic principles of the criminal law. Wherefore, applicant demands, etc., etc., be revised in accordance with CHS 909, 910, S2, 912, and 928 of the Code, etc., etc., and referring the case back for a new trial to a different part of the same court. Well, now, everything that could be done was done, but I will be frank with you. The probabilities of success are slight. However, everything depends on who will be sitting in the Senate. If you know anyone among them, bestir yourself. Yes, I know some. Then you must hasten, for they will soon be gone on their vacation and won't return for 3 months. In case of failure, the only recourse will be to petition the Tsar. I shall be at your service also in that contingency. I thank you. And now, as to your honorarium. My clerk will hand you the petition, and also my bill. One more question I would like to ask you. The prosecutor gave me a pass for the prison, but I was told there that it was necessary to obtain the governor's permission to visit the prison on other than visitors' days. Is it necessary? I think so, but he is away, and the lieutenant is in his place. You mean Maslenikov? Yes. I know him, said Nekhlyudov, rising to leave. At that moment, the lawyer's wife, an extremely ugly, pug-nosed and bony woman, rushed into the room. Not only was her attire unusually original, she was fairly loaded down with plush and silk things, bright yellow and green, but her oily hair was done up in curls, and she triumphantly rushed into the reception room, accompanied by a tall, smiling man with an earth-colored face, in a cutaway coat with silk facings and a white tie. This was an author. He knew Nekhlyudov by sight. Anatol, she said, opening the door, come here. Semyon Ivanovitch promised to read to us his poem, and you must read something from Garshin. Nekhlyudov was preparing to go, but the lawyer's wife whispered something to her husband and turned to him. I know you, Prince, and consider an introduction unnecessary. Won't you please attend our literary breakfast? It will be very interesting. Anatol is an excellent reader. You see what variety of duties I have, said Anatol, smiling and pointing at his wife, thereby expressing the impossibility of resisting that bewitching person. With a sad and grave face, and with the greatest politeness, Nekhlyudov thanked the lawyer's wife for the invitation, pleaded other engagements, and went into the reception room. What faces he makes, the lawyer's wife said of him when he had left the room. In the reception room, the clerk handed him the petition, and in answer to Nekhludov's question about the honorarium, said that Anatol Semyonovitch set his fee at 1,000 rubles, that he really does not take such cases, but does it for Nekhludov. "And who is to sign the petition?" asked Nekhludov. "The prisoner may sign it herself, and if that be troublesome, she may empower Anatol Semyonovitch." "No, I will go to the prison and obtain her signature," said Nekhludov, rejoicing at the opportunity of seeing Katusha before the appointed day.